The morning sunlight filtered softly through the windows of Evelyn's café, casting warm golden hues over the wooden tables. The café hummed with its usual rhythm, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle clatter of cups, and the faint murmur of conversations. Evelyn, the elderly owner, stood behind the counter, wiping a coffee cup as she exchanged smiles with the regulars. Outside, the faint rumble of an engine broke the monotony. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted, masking whoever was inside. The sound of the café's bell jingling filled the room as the door swung open. A tall, poised young man stepped in, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was dressed simply in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, but his face sparked recognition. "Is that?" whispered a young barista to her colleague, her voice barely audible. Evelyn's hand froze mid-wipe. She squinted at the figure, her heart skipping a beat. "It can't be," she muttered under her breath. But there was no mistaking him. It was Barron Trump. The room seemed to hold its breath, the soft chatter fading into stunned silence. Customers exchanged wide-eyed glances, some fumbling for their phones, though none dared to approach. Evelyn noticed how he carried himself, not with the arrogance one might expect, but with a calm, almost shy confidence. His gaze swept the room, not with superiority, but as if searching for something familiar. He walked to the counter, his towering height making the petite barista look up nervously. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep yet gentle, carrying a tone of warmth that immediately put her at ease. "What's your most popular drink?" The barista blinked, flustered for a moment, then quickly recovered. That would be our caramel latte," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll have one of those," Barron replied with a small smile, slipping a crisp bill onto the counter. "And a slice of whatever you recommend." Evelyn, still frozen behind the counter, watched as Barron moved to a corner table, his presence transforming the café. This wasn't just an ordinary visit, it was the start of something none of them could have anticipated. Why had he come here, and what could this unexpected encounter mean? Barron settled into the corner table, his tall frame folding gracefully into the wooden chair. The faint hum of conversations resumed, though hushed and filled with curiosity. Eyes flickered in his direction, some discreet, others openly staring. Yet, Barron seemed oblivious to the weight of the room's attention. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the café's vintage decor, the faded posters, the old clock ticking softly, and a family photograph on the wall behind the counter. The barista approached nervously, balancing his caramel latte and a slice of freshly baked apple pie. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the table. "Here you go, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Barron looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking with hers for a fleeting moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but kind. "And please, call me Barron." The barista flushed, murmuring an awkward "of course," before retreating to the safety of the counter. She exchanged a look with Evelyn, who had been watching the entire interaction. The older woman's heart softened. There was something unexpected in the way he carried himself, nothing of the entitled arrogance often associated with power and privilege. Instead, he exuded a quiet humility that made her curious. As Barron sipped his latte, he seemed lost in thought. His expression, though calm, carried a subtle weight, a distant melancholy. Evelyn, who had spent decades reading people's emotions, noticed it immediately. She leaned over to her barista. "He's not here by chance," she said in a low voice. "There's a reason he walked into this café." At another table, a group of college students whispered among themselves, sneaking glances at him. "He's so normal," one of them said, her voice tinged with surprise. "I expected something else, I guess." Barron, catching their glances, offered them a polite smile. It was disarming, genuine. The students exchanged looks, startled by his warmth. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this visit than met the eye. She thought of her late husband, a memory stirring deep within her, though she couldn't quite place it. As she watched Barron take another sip, she felt a pull, a need to connect, to uncover the story that had brought him here. What lay behind those distant eyes, and what connection could he possibly have to Evelyn's cafe? Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Barron's presence in her cafe was no coincidence. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing in thought as memories tugged at the edges of her mind. There was something familiar about him, not just his famous face, but something deeper, as though his arrival had awakened a distant fragment of her past. Barron sat quietly in his corner, occasionally glancing around with an air of quiet reflection. His gaze lingered on the small plaque on the wall near the counter, a tribute to Evelyn's late husband, Richard. The words etched into it read, "In memory of Richard Green, whose kindness brewed more joy than coffee ever could." Evelyn's heart skipped as she saw Barron's expression soften, his lips pressing into a faint smile. Her hands tightened around the coffee pot she was holding. Could he know? Was there some connection between Barron and Richard? It seemed impossible, yet she couldn't dismiss the thought. She shuffled back behind the counter and leaned toward her young barista. "You know," she began in a low voice, "Richard used to work at one of the Trump properties back in the day. It was before Barron was born, but he always spoke so fondly of the family. Said they were kind." The barista's eyes widened. "Do you think he remembers something about Richard?" she whispered, glancing toward Barron. Evelyn's chest tightened. She remembered Richard coming home late one night, years ago, with an unusual smile on his face. He had told her about a young boy, shy, polite, and towering even at that age, who had handed him a handwritten thank-you note for fixing a mechanical issue on the property. Richard had kept that note, tucked away in a drawer, calling it a reminder of how small gestures could leave lasting impressions. "I'm going to find it," Evelyn murmured to herself, her voice resolute. She handed the coffee pot to the barista and made her way to the small office behind the cafe. Her hands shook as she opened the drawer where Richard had kept his keepsakes. From the corner of his eye, Barron watched her disappear into the back. His calm exterior remained, but his eyes flickered with something unspoken, as though he, too, was searching for a connection he hadn't fully uncovered yet. What memory from Richard's past would Evelyn uncover, and how deeply was Barron tied to it? Evelyn emerged from the back room, her heart heavy with memories. In her hand was a faded envelope, the edges worn with time. Inside, Richard's cherished keepsake, a note from years ago, sat folded neatly. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach Barron with it yet. For now, she decided to observe him, hoping the moment to share her discovery would reveal itself naturally. At his corner table, Barron remained quietly immersed in his surroundings, his demeanor calm yet contemplative. His eyes drifted toward a table across the room, where a young mother struggled to calm her restless toddler. The child whined loudly, his cries cutting through the gentle hum of the cafe. The mother looked frazzled, her face a mixture of exhaustion and embarrassment as she tried to soothe her son. Barron's gaze softened. Without drawing attention to himself, he raised a hand to catch the barista's eye. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and steady. "Could you add her bill to mine? And maybe bring her another coffee. She looks like she could use one." The barista blinked in surprise but nodded quickly. "Of course, sir." The gesture was so subtle that no one else noticed, except Evelyn. She watched with a mix of awe and emotion as Barron returned to his latte, his act of kindness executed without expectation of acknowledgement. Moments later, the barista approached the young mother, quietly informing her that her bill had been taken care of. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Who?" she began, but the barista only gestured toward Barron's table. The mother looked over, tears welling up in her eyes as she realized who he was. Barron caught her gaze and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She mouthed a heartfelt thank you, clutching her child closer. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted. Conversations grew quieter, as if everyone had unknowingly absorbed the warmth of the moment. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the sincerity behind it. Barron wasn't performing for attention. He was simply being kind. As Evelyn held the envelope tighter, she felt a sudden resolve. Perhaps Barron's visit wasn't just a coincidence. There was something about him, a thread of humanity and humility, that mirrored the values Richard had cherished. Was this act of kindness a reflection of the boy Richard had once spoken about, and how would Evelyn bridge the gap between the past and the present? The café's air grew heavier with an inexplicable emotion, a silent acknowledgment of the unassuming grace Barron had brought into the room. Evelyn stood behind the counter, clutching the faded envelope, her heart torn between hesitation and urgency. She glanced at Barron, who now gazed out the window, lost in thought. The young man seemed not like a visitor but a puzzle piece that had quietly fallen into place in her life. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed the envelope's creases and walked toward his table. Her footsteps were steady, though her chest tightened with each step. Barron looked up as she approached, his expression polite yet curious. Evelyn felt her voice tremble as she spoke. "Mr. Trump," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Please call me Barron," he said with a soft smile. "Barron," she corrected herself, nodding. "There's something I think you should see. It's about my husband, Richard." She placed the envelope on the table between them, her hands lingering there as though afraid to let it go. Barron tilted his head, his expression shifting from curiosity to genuine interest. He carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the note inside. The handwriting was old, slightly faded, but still legible. His brows furrowed as he read, "To Barron, a kind soul in a world that often forgets kindness. Stay true to who you are, no matter where life takes you." Richard Green. Barron froze. His fingers lingered on the paper as if the words carried a weight that rooted him in place. His jaw tightened, and Evelyn saw something rare, a vulnerability that slipped past his composed exterior. He looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richard, he was the mechanic at one of my father's properties, wasn't he?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "He was. He spoke about you often. Said you were different, even as a boy. Thoughtful. Genuine. This note, he left it, hoping it would find its way to you someday." Barron leaned back, his gaze distant but filled with emotion. "I remember him," he said softly. "He treated everyone with respect. Even a kid like me." His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. Evelyn sat down across from him, the years between their stories suddenly bridged. What deeper connection did Richard's words hold for Barron, and how would this shared memory shape what came next? The café seemed to shrink into silence, the hum of its usual life fading into the background. Evelyn and Barron sat across from one another, the folded note resting on the table between them like a bridge spanning decades. Evelyn could feel her pulse in her ears, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. Barron, however, broke the silence first. "I didn't think anyone remembered," he said quietly, his voice tinged with both surprise and a touch of sadness. "Richard, he always had time for everyone. Even for me, a kid who didn't know much about the world back then." Evelyn's throat tightened, her grip on her apron twisting unconsciously. "He remembered you, Barron. Not just as some boy he met on the job, but as someone who stood out. He said you were kind, even when you didn't need to be. And he held onto that memory like it was something precious." Barron glanced at the note again, his fingers tracing the edges as though it might crumble if he let go. His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "There weren't many people who treated me like I was normal," he admitted, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. "Richard, he didn't see a name or a title. He saw a kid who needed someone to talk to, even for just a moment." Evelyn smiled faintly, her mind flashing back to the nights Richard would come home with stories of his day. "He said you had a habit of asking the kind of questions adults don't know how to answer," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. questions about life, about kindness. He thought it was remarkable. Barron chuckled softly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. I didn't think he remembered me like that. He paused, his expression growing solemn. I guess I didn't realize how much those moments meant to me either. Until now. Reaching into his jacket pocket, Barron pulled out a small leather wallet and carefully placed something on the table. An old photograph of a younger Richard, leaning against his toolbox, a smile stretched across his face. Evelyn gasped. "You kept this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Barron nodded. "He gave it to me. Told me to hold onto it, to remember the value of hard work and humility." What hidden message did Richard's memory hold, and how would it change Barron's next steps? The photograph rested on the table, its edges slightly worn but its image vivid. Evelyn's eyes locked onto it, her breath catching in her throat. There was Richard as she remembered him, his broad smile, his eyes sparkling with warmth, and the faint smudge of grease on his cheek. For a moment, it felt like he was there with them, bridging the past and present. Barron's voice broke the stillness, low and reflective. "When Richard gave me this, I didn't understand why it mattered so much. I was just a kid who didn't think about the future. But now," he exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world had found him again, "I realize he was giving me something more than a photograph. He was giving me a piece of himself." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. "That's exactly who Richard was," she whispered. "He believed in leaving people with more than they expected." Whether it was fixing a broken machine or just offering a kind word, he made sure his presence counted. Barron nodded, his fingers still lightly touching the photo. "I didn't have many people like that growing up," he admitted, his tone raw. "Everyone was always trying to impress my father or prove something to the world. But Richard, he just listened. He made me feel like I mattered, even without all the noise." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes. "He used to tell me about you," she said softly. "About how you'd ask him what it meant to be a good man. He said that question stayed with him for days, even years later. He'd always say, 'That boy is going to do something remarkable one day.' Not because of who he is, but because of what he is." Barron swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I wish I could have told him how much those conversations meant to me," he said, his voice breaking. "How much they still mean." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "He knew, Barron," she said firmly. "He always knew. That's why he left you this note, this reminder. He believed in you." Would Barron be able to honor Richard's belief in him, and how would this moment shape his path forward? The café seemed to fade into the background as Barron sat in quiet contemplation, Evelyn's words echoing in his mind. "He believed in you." For the first time in years, Barron felt something stir deep within him, a sense of purpose that had long been buried beneath the weight of expectations and the noise of the world. He leaned forward, his large hands enveloping the photograph on the table. His voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "It's strange, isn't it? How someone can leave such a lasting impression with the smallest acts of kindness. I've been surrounded by so much pretense, so many people trying to prove their worth through power or wealth. But Richard, he never needed any of that." Evelyn nodded, her expression tender but tinged with sadness. "Richard believed that true wealth wasn't in what you had, but in what you gave to others. And he saw that same potential in you, Barron, even as a boy." Barron's lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. "He taught me more in those small moments than most people did in years," he admitted. "He didn't talk down to me or treat me like I was different. He just cared." Evelyn could see the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, the struggle of a young man trying to reconcile the past with the present. She leaned closer, her voice firm but gentle. "Barron, You've carried his lessons with you all this time, even if you didn't realize it. That kindness you showed to the woman earlier, the way you listen, the way you carry yourself, it's all a reflection of what Richard saw in you." Barron's gaze dropped to the note again, his fingers tracing the edges of Richard's handwriting. "It's easy to forget what really matters when you're surrounded by so much noise," he said quietly. "But sitting here, remembering him, it's like I can finally hear the silence. And in that silence, I can feel him." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Then maybe that's why you're here," she said. "To remember. To carry forward what he left behind. Not just for you, but for everyone you'll meet." Barron looked up, his expression clearer, more resolved. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a direction, one not shaped by his name, but by his heart. Would Barron take this newfound clarity and turn it into action, and how would he honor the man who believed in him? The café felt like a sanctuary now, cocooned in an air of shared understanding. Evelyn watched Barron, her heart heavy yet hopeful. There was something different in the way he held himself. His shoulders seemed lighter, his expression softer. Still, she knew this was a fragile moment, the kind where words carried the power to heal or deepen the wounds. "Barron," she began, her voice steady but tender, "Richard used to tell me something every night after work. He'd say, 'Kindness doesn't need recognition to matter. It's the quiet moments that leave the loudest echoes.'" Barron exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair as her words settled over him. "He was right," he said after a pause, his voice tinged with regret. "But it's so easy to get caught up in the noise. Everyone's always watching, judging, expecting something from me. Sometimes it feels like I'm just a name, not a person." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "And yet, here you are, proving them wrong," she said firmly. "The Barron I've seen today is more than just a name. He's someone who makes people feel seen, someone who chooses to be kind when no one's looking. That's who you are, not what the world expects you to be." Barron looked down at the note once more, his thumb brushing over the words Richard had written. "Do you think he knew?" he asked quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Do you think he knew I'd remember him, even after all these years?" Evelyn smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears. "Richard always said the most important lessons are the ones we don't realize we're learning. He wasn't just teaching you, he was planting seeds. And now, those seeds are growing." Barron nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as a wave of emotion surged through him. "I've spent so much time trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "But maybe it's simpler than I thought. Maybe it's just about living the way Richard did, with humility and purpose." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand resting gently over his. "Then you already have your answer, Barron," she said softly. "You honor him every time you choose kindness, every time you choose to listen, and every time you remember that who you are is enough." Would Barron finally take the first step toward living out Richard's legacy, and how would this moment reshape his future? The café had grown quiet again, but the weight of their conversation lingered in the air. Barron sat silently, the photograph still resting in his hands, while Evelyn watched him with a gentle smile. She knew the moment they shared had been more than a glimpse into the past. It was a stepping stone toward something new. Barron's expression was thoughtful, his eyes focused but calm. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I never thought I'd come back here, let alone have a conversation like this," he said softly. "Richard's words, they stayed with me, but I never really understood them until now." Evelyn gave a small nod. "He left you more than just lessons, Barron. He left you the space to grow into your own story, a story filled with meaning beyond the world's expectations." Barron smiled faintly, his lips twitching upward. "And what about you, Evelyn? How do you carry on without him?" Her gaze softened, and her voice wavered slightly. I carry him in every conversation, in every moment spent here. His spirit is still alive in this cafe, in the people who come in with their own stories, their own struggles. Just like Richard taught me, I try to make each one count. The room fell into a peaceful stillness once again, each thought settling like fallen leaves. Barron placed the photograph back into his wallet, tucking it away with reverence. He knew it wasn't just a keepsake, it was a reminder of what truly mattered. "You're not just remembering Richard," Evelyn said gently, her eyes meeting his. "You're carrying forward what he stood for. And in doing so, you're honoring him in the best way possible." Barron's gaze locked onto hers, the weight of his emotions heavy but clear. "Maybe that's what I've been searching for all along, someone to remind me that the path forward doesn't have to be complicated. It can be simple. Kind." Evelyn gave a small smile, her hand resting lightly on the counter. "And it starts here, with every small act of kindness you offer." "You've already begun." Barron's expression softened, a quiet resolve settling in his eyes. "You're right," he said quietly. "It starts now. If you've ever found yourself searching for meaning or purpose, remember that even the smallest acts of kindness can create a ripple effect. How can you carry forward a piece of someone's legacy in your own life? Let us know in the comments below.